Rob, I was thinking we could finally get a little vacation time next month, Haley suggested, her voice casual as she took a sip of her evening tea. Rob looked up from the book he was flipping through. They were sitting in their usual spots on the porch, where they'd watched the sunset together countless times. He noticed the hopeful smile on her face and felt a swell of warmth. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, setting his book aside. "But let's make it something big this time. After all, we're coming up on 25 years. Can you believe it?" His face lit up with genuine excitement. Yes, big indeed," she murmured, a strange flicker in her eyes. Her gaze drifted out toward the fading light, and for a moment, Rob thought he saw something cold. The moment passed quickly, and Rob brushed it off. He never imagined Haley capable of anything but love for him. To him, she was everything. Her occasional moodiness was just part of who she was, and he had long ago learned to accept it without question. They had their routines, their quirks, and their dreams, one of which was the long-planned retirement they'd talked about for years. The next morning, Rob was alone in the study. He promised to help Haley clean out some old boxes, sorting through years of accumulated memories and clutter. He lifted a box of old books and knickknacks onto the desk, dust swirling around him. He reached in, pulling out photos, an old record player, and finally, a small leather-bound book that he didn't recognize. It looked well-worn, with pages faintly yellowed. Curious, he opened it and quickly realized it was Haley's handwriting. He debated whether to read it, but something in him, a quiet voice, urged him on. As he flipped through the pages, reading familiar musings and grocery lists, he found himself smiling. But then he turned to the final entry, and his heart stopped. "Rob thinks the vacation home is a surprise for our 25th anniversary and that our savings are for our retirement together. But if only he knew, it's where Gary and I plan to retire once the divorce is final. I'll get all our savings and everything, and that loser won't even see it coming." The words blurred as his hands began to shake. He set the diary down on the desk, his mind a storm of disbelief and fury. He felt his pulse hammering in his chest, echoing his anger as he read the words again and again, trying to comprehend divorce, taking everything. The love he thought was as constant as the tide suddenly revealed itself to be a lie. He sat down, his legs numb beneath him. His trust in her had been like a solid pillar, holding up everything in his life, and now it was as though that pillar had been shattered, leaving him buried in its rubble. He felt sick, betrayed on a level he couldn't have imagined. After a few long minutes, he picked up the diary again, as if the words would somehow change. But they didn't. She was planning to take everything, to leave him alone, broken and penniless. And for what? Some fantasy with Gary, someone he'd never even heard of. The rage simmered beneath the shock, now anger replacing his numbness. He remembered the moments they had shared, the promises, the dreams. He thought of the vacations, the sacrifices, the home they had built together over decades. To her, it was all just a means to an end. Rob's face twisted as he shut the diary with a snap. For the first time, his thoughts went dark. He could confront her, demand an explanation, he could plead, but he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. No, he wasn't going to let her see just how much she destroyed. Instead, he turned her betrayal against her. The rage that filled him took on a new clarity as he began to formulate a plan. That evening, when Haley returned from her errands, Rob was waiting in the kitchen. He poured her a glass of wine and was busy chopping vegetables for dinner, his movements precise and methodical. "Hey, honey," he greeted her with a smile. "Thought we'd have a quiet dinner tonight. I've been thinking about that vacation, 25 years is something special." Haley looked surprised, but pleasantly so. "Oh, that sounds lovely," she replied, taking a sip of wine. "I was thinking we could go all out," he continued, watching her face closely as he spoke. "Maybe even spend some time at that vacation home we bought. It'll be good to get away." There was a flicker in her eyes, something almost too quick to catch. She forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, that would be nice," she agreed. "We could use a change of scenery." Rob felt a bitter taste in his mouth as he watched her pretend. His chest tightened, but he kept his expression light. So he said, raising his glass, to 25 years. She raised her glass, her smile unsteady. To us, she replied. Inside, he seethed, but he would let her think she'd won for now. He played along, maintaining the facade. Every gesture, every word was measured. He kept his anger hidden, cold and calculating. Over the next few days, Rob began making phone calls. He spoke to his lawyer, getting advice and ensuring he could move money out of their joint accounts. He didn't plan to leave her a single cent, the vacation home he was going to sell, and she'd be none the wiser. Late one evening, as Haley slept, Rob slipped back into the study, diary in hand. He read the words once more, sealing them in his mind. The anger was still there, but now there was a strange clarity that came with it. He knew what he needed to do. Rob thought the vacation home was a surprise. The words echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of her betrayal. But if Haley thought she could fool him, she was wrong. She played her hand, and now it was his turn. As he sat there, he imagined the look on her face when she realized everything she'd tried to steal was gone, that she'd lost not only his love and his trust but her future as well. And then, in the quiet of the study, Rob allowed himself one last look at the life he'd thought he had. He let the memories wash over him, the good, the bad, all of it. It felt like the end of something important, but also strangely like a beginning. In the darkness, he whispered to himself a promise as cold as steel. You'll regret this, Haley. You and Gary both. With that, he closed the diary, set it back in its place, and left the study, already feeling lighter. The plan was set, and from now on, there was no going back. Rob slid a plate of roast chicken and potatoes across the table to Haley, who settled in with a slight smile. She seemed distracted. Her eyes occasionally flickered over to her phone on the counter. Honey, Rob began, his tone cheerful, as he poured them each a glass of wine. I'm so excited. I have a surprise planned for us soon. Haley raised an eyebrow. Her face was carefully controlled, but he saw a hint of curiosity. Oh, really? She asked. Yes, he replied with a grin, letting just enough enthusiasm seep through to make it believable. It's something I've been planning for a while. Just you wait. She tried to look excited, but Rob noticed her calculating gaze. She picked up her wine glass, giving him a suspicious smile. A surprise for our anniversary? He nodded, biting back the bitterness that rose up. Yep, something special, just for us. They ate in silence for a while. Every now and then he would glance up, catching her eye. He wondered if she was already thinking of ways to spin his surprise in her favor. He could see her mind working behind those guarded eyes, but she didn't press him, likely content with whatever she had planned on her own. The next morning, Rob started making calls from his office. He contacted the bank first, asking about the logistics of setting up a trust. The representative confirmed that it could be done without Haley's knowledge, as long as it was a single beneficiary setup. Once the paperwork arrived, Rob carefully went over every detail. He made sure that Haley's name didn't appear anywhere on it. The money going into this trust was a substantial chunk of their joint savings funds. They had talked about using it for their retirement for that vacation home. But Rob had different plans now. After double-checking that everything was in order, he signed the papers. His lawyer assured him that by the end of the month, half of their assets would be under his sole control. A few days later, as they were sitting together after dinner, Rob looked across the table at Haley. She was scrolling through her phone, occasionally smirking at something on the screen, likely a message from Gary, he thought, with a pain of disgust. Do you remember that old vacation home we got a few years back? Rob asked, trying to sound casual. Haley glanced up, her expression neutral. Of course, why, he continued. I was thinking maybe we should put it on the market. We hardly go there anymore, and with our anniversary trip coming up, we could use a little extra cash. Haley's face froze for a moment. Then she forced a smile. Oh, I don't know, she said. I kind of like having it there, just in case we need a getaway. True, Rob replied, shrugging. But it could be a nice boost to our retirement fund. Haley sipped her wine, her eyes narrowing slightly. Let me think about it, okay? It's a big decision. Sure. Rob agreed, knowing full well that he'd already initiated the sale. His lawyer would handle the paperwork. All he needed now was for her to stay distracted enough not to notice. Over the following days, Rob carefully watched Haley's routines. Every morning, she would spend at least an hour at her favorite coffee shop, sometimes making phone calls as she sat at the corner table by the window. He followed her once, sitting in his car across the street and watching as she laughed on the phone, looking completely at ease. He wanted to storm in and demand she come clean about Gary and her plans, but he reminded himself of his goal. Confronting her would only ruin the satisfaction he'd get from executing his plan. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. Instead, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails from his lawyer and the real estate agent handling the vacation home sale. Everything was moving along smoothly. He had managed to transfer the property into his name alone without her realizing it. As he looked up, he saw Haley get into her car, her face set in a calm, confident expression. It was almost laughable how completely she underestimated him. The following week, Rob cooked another elaborate dinner, making sure the table was set perfectly. Haley walked in, glancing around with a hint of surprise. "What's the occasion?" she asked, taking off her coat. "Oh, nothing special," Rob replied, flashing her a smile. "Just wanted to make something nice for you. Thought it'd be a good night to talk about that trip we were planning." Haley's face brightened slightly. "All right, the anniversary trip. I'd almost forgotten." "Yeah, I think it'll be a great way to celebrate everything we've built," Rob said, watching her reaction carefully. She nodded, seeming almost believed. "You're right, it'll be nice to get away from everything for a bit." As they ate, Haley began to relax, chatting about the places they could visit. Rob could tell that she was warming to the idea of the trip, likely seeing it as a cover for her real plans with Gary. She was eager, leaning forward as she listed off various places they could explore. He nodded along, playing his part well, even as he reminded himself that her dream vacation home was already in the process of being sold. Every cent from that sale would be securely tied up in a trust, one she would never have access to. After dinner, Rob poured them both a glass of whiskey, leaning back as they talked for the first time in weeks. He felt almost relaxed, knowing that his plan was in motion. They clinked glasses, and Haley seemed genuinely happy, as though she believed her scheme was working out perfectly. 2 days later, Rob got the call he had been waiting for. The real estate agent informed him that the vacation home sale had gone through without a hitch, and that the money had already been wired to his account. Rob sat back in his chair, feeling an immense sense of satisfaction. It was all falling into place. That evening, he came home to find Haley in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. "I have to tell you something," he said, leaning against the counter. She looked up slightly startled. "What is it?" He paused, savoring the moment. "I went ahead and sold the vacation home. I know you were hesitant, but well, I figured it was the best decision." Haley's face fell, and for a moment, she looked as though she'd been struck. "You sold it?" "Yeah, got a good price too," Rob replied smoothly. "And the money's already in the account, so we're all set for our anniversary." He watched her carefully as she struggled to keep her expression neutral. "I see," she said finally, her voice tight. "Well, if you think that was best, I do," Rob said, his tone final. She nodded, looking away quickly, and Rob could see her mind working, trying to process what this would mean for her plan. But he knew there was no way she could salvage it now. Everything she'd counted on was slipping through her fingers. As they sat down to eat, Rob felt an odd sense of calm settle over him. This was just the beginning. Rob knew the day was coming. Every step he'd taken, every calculated decision had been building up to this moment. But even with his carefully constructed plan, seeing Haley and Gary together was something he hadn't been fully prepared for. It was early afternoon, and he trailed Haley across town to a small, quiet cafe. She'd been secretive about her errands lately, leaving home with vague excuses. Today, Rob decided to follow her, keeping his distance as he watched her walk into the cafe. He waited outside, watching through the window as she took a seat at a corner table. Not long after, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and an easy smile slid into the seat across from her, Gary. Rob clenched his fists, staying hidden behind a nearby parked car. He had always imagined what Gary might look like, but seeing him in person, seeing Haley's warm smile reserved for this man, drove a pang of anger through him. He forced himself to stay calm, to listen rather than act. "So, when's the old man finding out?" Gary asked, his voice low but amused. Haley laughed, leaning in close to him. "Rob won't even know what hit him. I've got this all planned out, and once the divorce is final, it'll be our little paradise." Gary reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "It's hard to believe he hasn't caught on. You really think he's that clueless?" Haley shook her head, grinning. "Oh, Rob's harmless. He never questions anything I do. He trusts me way too much." Rob's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay hidden. His anger sharpened his resolve. Their laughter, their shared plans, every moment was a bitter confirmation of the betrayal he'd uncovered. This wasn't just a fling. They'd been planning a future together, and they thought he was nothing but an obstacle, someone to manipulate and cast aside. "So, what's the plan with the money?" Gary asked, keeping his tone casual. "I'll get half of everything," Haley replied with confidence. "Once the divorce goes through, we'll have enough to settle down somewhere warm, and that vacation home will be all ours." Gary chuckled, his hand tightening around hers. "You're one devious woman, Haley. Remind me to never get on your bad side." Haley laughed again, almost proud of herself. "Don't worry, darling. You'll never have to." Rob watched as she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. Though he could still make out the words, "It's funny. Rob still thinks he's planning some grand anniversary trip. He's so clueless, it's almost sad." Gary shook his head, amused. "Guess it makes things easier for us." They continued to chat, their voices blending with the hum of the cafe. But Rob had heard enough. He moved quietly away from his hiding spot, forcing himself to keep his head clear. Anger coursed through him, but it was no longer the same raw, overwhelming feeling as before. This was different, colder, more precise. That evening, Rob sat in his study, going over the final documents he'd spoken to his lawyer about earlier in the day. He was finalizing the trust account and ensuring the vacation home sale was airtight. Haley wouldn't see a single penny from it. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling in. The plan was clear now. He wouldn't just confront her, he'd let her think she'd won. He'd be the clueless husband she thought he was, right until the moment her world crumbled. The next night, as they sat down for dinner, Rob brought up the anniversary trip again. Haley seemed oddly enthusiastic about the idea, as if she'd finally convinced herself that he was completely oblivious. "So, I was thinking," he said, his voice casual, "maybe we should take a trip to Europe. You've always wanted to go, haven't you?" Haley looked up, caught off guard. "Europe?" she repeated, clearly not expecting that. Rob nodded. "Yeah, we could go all out, France, Italy, maybe even Spain. A real adventure." Her face lit up, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of genuine excitement. "That sounds amazing, Rob," she said softly. He watched her, noticing the small glint in her eyes as she likely calculated how a trip like that would fit into her own plans. "Maybe we could even start looking at properties out there," he suggested, his tone smooth. "You know, for our retirement." Haley's expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, smiling brightly. "Oh yes, that could be interesting." Rob returned to smile, forcing himself to stay composed post. She had no idea how close she was to losing everything the following week. Rob pretended to be busy with work projects while he continued finalizing his arrangements. He transferred the last of their joint savings into the trust account. With each move, he felt a sense of freedom, as if he was finally reclaiming the life Haley had stolen from him. When he came home one evening, he found Haley sitting on the couch, her face tense. "Rob," she began, her tone soft but serious. "We need to talk." He kept his expression neutral, hiding the dread that bubbled beneath his calm facade. "Sure, what's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting. "I think it's time we started being more honest with each other," she said carefully. "There are things I need to tell you, things I've been holding back." Rob's heart pounded, but he kept his tone even. I'm listening. She hesitated, glancing down as she fiddled with her hands. It's just after 25 years, people change. Maybe we've both changed, and it's only fair that we face it. Face what exactly? He asked, pretending to look puzzled. She sighed, giving him a sympathetic look that felt sickeningly condescending. Maybe we've outgrown each other, Rob. Maybe it's time we each find what really makes us happy. Rob kept his face calm, his mind calculating. Is that what you want, Haley? To his surprise, her face softened, almost as if she were doing him a favor. I think it's best for both of us, really. We can still be friends. Rob, you'll be happier. He studied her for a moment, allowing a faint smile to cross his face. If that's what you think is best, Haley, I just want you to be happy. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised by his lack of resistance. Thank you, Rob. I knew you'd understand. Of course, he said, his voice calm and level. In fact, I'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about a thing. She gave him a grateful smile, clearly relieved by his response. Thank you. I knew you'd see it this way. The next morning, Rob left the divorce papers on her desk with a note attached. He'd been up all night making sure every detail was flawless. He left the house early, wanting to be gone when she found the documents. As he drove, he could only imagine her reaction. By midday, his phone buzzed with messages. Haley called him repeatedly, her texts desperate, her tone panicked. Rob, what is this? Why are the accounts empty? Where is the money for the vacation home? You can't do this. He ignored every message, letting her pleas pile up. Unanswered by the end of the day, she was begging him to meet her, her earlier confidence shattered. Finally, as the sun set, he sent her a single reply. Hope you have another retirement plan, because this one is over. He could almost feel the weight of her shock, the realization that she'd been outplayed, as he walked away from the life they'd shared. Rob felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Haley had betrayed him, but now the final betrayal was hers to bear. And as for Rob, he was free to start again on his own terms. Rob sat alone in his hotel room, imagining the shock and panic that must have hit her when she found out. By now, she would have realized the full extent of his actions. He checked his phone, noting several missed calls from both Haley and Gary, but he ignored them all. Their frantic messages didn't concern him anymore. This was their mess now. It was late that night when Rob's peace was shattered by a loud, desperate pounding on his hotel door. He didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and found himself face to face with Haley. Her face was red and streaked with tears, a look of sheer desperation in her eyes. Rob, you can't be serious, she sobbed, her voice cracking. We've been married for so long. Please, you can't throw it all away because of one mistake. He held her gaze, his face expressionless. One mistake, Haley? This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal. You had an affair, you planned a future with another man, and you were going to take everything we built together for yourself. It wasn't like that, she protested, reaching out to him, but he took a step back, avoiding her touch. I was confused. I thought we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to fix things. So, instead of talking to me, you planned to take our life, our savings, and leave me with nothing. His voice was cold, and he watched as her face fell, guilt and shame flashing across her features. Please, Rob, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. I made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but we can fix this. I know we can. He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Fix this? Do you even understand what you've done? She took a step closer, her hands trembling. I know I was wrong, Rob. I was so wrong, but please don't throw away everything we've built. I'll do anything to make it right. Rob folded his arms, his gaze hard. Where was this remorse when you were planning to run off with Gary? Or when you were laughing at how clueless I was? He paused, then added, I heard you, Haley. I heard every word. Her eyes widened in shock as realization dawned. You knew? He nodded. Yes, I followed you to that cafe. I heard you and Gary talking about your little paradise. So don't stand here and pretend this was a moment of weakness. She was silent, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words. Eventually, she managed to say, I never meant for it to get this far, but it did, Haley. And now you're going to live with the consequences. For the next hour, she sat on the edge of the hotel bed, begging and pleading, trying every argument she could think of. She promised to cut Gary out of her life, to go to therapy, to do anything he wanted, but Rob's face remained impassive. It's too late for that, Haley, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. This isn't something I can just forget. The trust is gone, and honestly, so is my respect for you. A look of fear and anger crossed her face. You transferred everything, all our savings. That was supposed to be for both of us. No, Haley, he corrected. You were planning to keep it for yourself. I just made sure you wouldn't get that chance. Her face crumpled as she processed his words, the full weight of her actions settling on her shoulders. She covered her face, breaking down in sobs. Please, Rob, we were so close to retirement, to everything we dreamed of. Don't take that away from me. He watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The woman he had loved, the one he had trusted with everything, was unrecognizable to him now. That was our dream, he said softly, until you destroyed it. The next day, Gary tried to reach out as well. Rob hadn't expected him to make an appearance, but that afternoon, as Rob was leaving his hotel, he saw Gary waiting for him outside. Gary stepped forward, his expression tense. Rob, wait, let's talk man to man. Rob kept walking, ignoring him, but Gary kept pace, his tone growing desperate. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean for things to get so messed up. Haley told me things weren't working out between you two. Rob stopped, turning to face Gary, his expression cold. You thought it was okay to betray me like that, to try and take what I built. Gary held up his hands defensively.
It was never about that.
Haley made her choices, and well, maybe I just went along with it. But now everything's ruined, and she's devastated. We never meant for it to end like this. Rob laughed bitterly. What did you expect? That I'd just roll over and hand everything to you? Gary opened his mouth to reply, but Rob held up a hand to stop him. You know what? I don't care. You can keep her. She's all yours now. Just don't expect a penny of my hard-earned money to go with her. Gary's face reddened, frustration mixing with shame. Please, you've made your point. Just give her a chance to make things right. Rob looked at him, feeling nothing but contempt. No, she had her chance, and she threw it away. Now the both of you can live with that. Gary's shoulders slumped as he watched Rob walk away, his last hope crumbling in silence. That evening, Haley made one final attempt to reach him. She called him over and over, leaving messages that ranged from tearful pleas to angry demands. But Rob refused to engage. Each message only confirmed what he already knew. She was more concerned about what she was losing than the betrayal she committed. Finally, she sent him one last message, her voice strained and broken. Rob, I know I hurt you, and I know you'll never forgive me. But please don't leave me with nothing. I can't start over. I don't know how to live without you. You listened to her words, but they felt hollow now. For too long, he had given everything, only to be used and betrayed in return. This was his chance to break free, to leave behind the lies and the hurt. Rob deleted the message, feeling an odd sense of release. He had done what he needed to do. Now he could move forward on his own terms. A week later, he finalized the divorce with his lawyer, making sure that Haley would be left with the minimum required by law. The rest of their assets were secured in the trust he had set up, untouchable to her or anyone else. And just like that, 25 years of marriage ended, not with an apology or reconciliation, but with a painful silence. When he walked out of the lawyer's office, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He was free from betrayal, from manipulation, and from the woman who had once been his whole world. He didn't look back. Rob leaned back in his new apartment, a modest but cozy space that felt refreshingly different from the home he once shared with Haley. Moving out was symbolic. It marked the start of his new life, a life he was determined to fill with his own meaning, without looking back. The revenge had been swift, and seeing Haley and Gary scramble to understand the gravity of what they'd lost had been both satisfying and sobering. Now, it was time to move forward. After finalizing the sale of the vacation home, Rob had redirected Haley's share to a charity organization dedicated to underprivileged families, and his share went to a scholarship fund for young photographers. He wasn't angry anymore. He felt lighter, as if his life had shed a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. One weekend, Rob decided to join a local hiking club, something he'd always wanted to try but had never had the time for. Early Saturday morning, he laced up his boots, slung a borrowed camera over his shoulder, and headed to the meeting point at a nearby trail. As he approached the group of hikers, he felt a twinge of nervousness, but a woman standing off to the side waved him over with a warm smile. "You must be new here," she said, extending her hand.
I'm Lucia.
Rob took her hand, surprised by her kindness. "Rob, nice to meet you, Lucia," he said. "First hike with the group?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes scanning the lush trees and rugged paths before them. "Yeah, I figure it's time to try something new." "Well, you picked a good day," she replied. "We're going to one of the best lookout points in the area." "You're into photography?" she asked, gesturing to the camera. "Trying to be," he chuckled. "I used to take photos years ago, but never really got serious about it." "Mind if I give you some pointers along the way?" Lucia offered. "Photography is my passion, please do," he replied, feeling at ease in her company as they trekked through the trails. Lucia shared stories about her favorite hiking spots and her love for capturing nature's details, be it the play of light through the trees or the serene flow of a hidden stream. Rob found himself smiling genuinely, enjoying the conversation. At one point, they paused to take a break on a rock overlooking a small, winding river. Lucia gestured for him to try taking a picture of the scene, guiding him to find the best angle and adjust the settings on his camera. "You've got a good eye," she commented, as she looked over his shoulder, admiring the shot he'd taken. He looked at her, feeling a spark of excitement that he hadn't felt in a long time. It's nice to get back into something just for the love of it. Life got complicated for a while. Lucia looked at him thoughtfully, but didn't press. "Sometimes complications are the best teachers. They remind us what matters," he replied, his tone softer. "And sometimes they show us that the life we thought we wanted wasn't really ours at all." Lucia smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I know what you mean. I went through something like that myself a few years back. Funny how life brings people to exactly where they need to be." The sincerity in her voice resonated with Rob, and he realized for the first time in years he was connecting with someone who seemed genuinely interested in him, with no hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Over the next few months, Rob and Lucia became close. They met up regularly for hikes, coffee, and photography outings, and their friendship grew naturally and comfortably. Lucia's support felt like a lifeline, a source of strength that had nothing to do with his past, but everything to do with his future. For the first time in years, Rob felt like he was reclaiming himself, discovering parts of himself he'd forgotten while building something new. One evening, after a particularly long hike, they sat on a grassy hill watching the sunset over the horizon. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and Rob felt a calm wash over him. "Thank you, Lucia," he said quietly. "You've been more of a friend than I thought I'd find at this stage of my life." Lucia looked at him, her expression soft. "You're the one who decided to come out here to try new things. You're doing all the hard work, Rob. I'm just here to cheer you on." He looked down, considering her words, and then met her gaze. "I'm not sure what's next for me, but it feels good to know there are people in my life I can trust." "Then take things one step at a time," she replied. "Life isn't a race." Meanwhile, as Rob was quietly rebuilding his life, Haley and Gary were feeling the full weight of his absence. Rob's attorney informed him that Haley had tried to contest the divorce settlement, but her attempts were quickly shut down. She'd hoped that her pleas would sway Rob, but he remained steadfast. He felt no need to engage with her or Gary. They had made their choices, and now they would face the reality without his support or sympathy. One day, Rob received a letter in the mail with familiar handwriting. It was from Haley, a desperate attempt at reconciliation. "Rob, I know I can't change the past, but please, I miss the life we had. I feel lost without you. I don't know how to move forward, and I'm struggling to make ends meet." Rob read the letter carefully, noting the tone of regret that hinted more at discomfort from her new circumstances than actual remorse. She described the difficulties she and Gary faced, the financial strain, the arguments, and the empty promises that had once seemed so appealing. Instead of responding, he placed the letter in a drawer. He no longer felt the urge to hold on to her words. That chapter was closed, and he felt more resolute than ever to keep it that way. Months turned into a year, and Rob found himself evolving in ways he hadn't imagined. He traveled to a few places he had always wanted to see, capturing landscapes and moments that reminded him of the beauty in life. His photography began to gain attention among his new friends, who encouraged him to display his work. With Lucia's help, he even submitted a few photos to a local gallery. One evening after a small gallery showing, Rob and Lucia sat outside on a patio, a glass of wine in each of their hands. "You did it," she said, raising her glass to him. "Your work is incredible, Rob." He clinked his glass against hers, a quiet smile on his face. "I never would have had the confidence to do this without you," he said. "That's what friends are for," she replied, her eyes twinkling in the dim light. A moment passed between them, a comfortable silence filled with gratitude and the promise of something deeper. Rob didn't feel the need to rush, but he was open to whatever came next. As he walked to her car that evening, Lucia paused, looking up at him. "You know, Rob, life is unpredictable, but I think it has a funny way of bringing us exactly what we need." He nodded, understanding the layers beneath her words. "Maybe it does." For the first time in a long while, Rob felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. No resentment, no regret, just the quiet joy of living a life he could call his own. And with Lucia by his side, he was ready for whatever the future held. It had been years since the divorce papers landed on Haley's desk, and though Rob hadn't thought much about her since, he noticed the persistence of her messages in his inbox. The subject lines went from cold requests for closure to pleading for a conversation, and eventually to desperate apologies. Each one went unanswered. Then one day she called. Rob's initial reaction was to ignore it, but something urged him to pick up. Maybe he thought it was time to finally close the store. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in town, one they had frequented in the early years of their marriage. When he walked in, he barely recognized her. Haley looked worn, her once impeccable appearance replaced with hollow eyes and an unsteady posture. She glanced up as he approached, and Rob noted the tension in her expression. "Rob," she began, her voice trembling as she tried to find the words. "Thank you for meeting me," he nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Let's keep this short, Haley. What do you want?" She hesitated, as though every word was carefully chosen. "I know I hurt you, Rob. I know that everything I did was wrong, and I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I need to ask just one last time. Will you forgive me?" Rob watched her, his face unreadable. He wasn't sure if it was pity, frustration, or indifference that kept him silent. After a pause, he finally replied, "Forgive you?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Haley, you were ready to take everything from me. Do you even understand the depth of that betrayal?" Her face flushed, her eyes cast down in shame. "I know I was selfish, and I didn't think about what it would do to you. I lost myself, but I thought we could rebuild. I thought maybe we could start over." Rob shook his head slowly. "Start over, Haley? You didn't just hurt me. You tried to erase our entire life together. You planned a future with someone else while we were still living our life." Haley swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Rob, I don't know what to say. I was a different person then, confused and then greedy. Gary is gone, and I have nothing left. I've learned my lesson." Rob's gaze hardened. "So, it took losing everything for you to understand what you'd done. It didn't cross your mind that the pain you caused was real until it became inconvenient for you." She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know I was wrong, but I loved you once, Rob. Maybe part of me still does. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Love me, Haley? You plotted against me. You sat across from me for months, lying to my face, all while planning your future with someone else. She reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. His jaw clenched as he fought to keep his composure. Rob, I'm begging you, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, I don't have anyone left. My family, our friends, they all know what I did, and they won't speak to me. I thought Gary and I had a future, but he left when things got tough. I have nothing now, no job, no home. I'm drowning. He watched her for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. Part of him felt a twisted satisfaction in seeing her world fall apart, knowing she was experiencing the emptiness he'd felt when he first uncovered her betrayal. But another part of him felt nothing. So now that you're alone and uncomfortable, I'm supposed to forget everything? He asked, his voice steady. Forgive you, so you can feel better about yourself? No, that's not what I mean, she stammered. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. To at least, I don't know, to find some peace. Peace, Rob echoed. I found my peace when I cut you out of my life. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she looked down, nodding as if accepting the finality of his words. I didn't think it would hurt this much, she whispered. Rob shook his head, unable to summon any sympathy. That's the problem, Haley. You thought only of yourself, your happiness, your desires. You never considered anyone else. You used me, lied to me, and for what? Some fantasy with a man who left you the moment reality set in. She wiped her tears, her hands shaking. Rob, please. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to live with this guilt forever. I just need a chance to what? He interrupted, his tone sharp. To feel better about what you did, to rebuild the life you threw away. She fell silent, her face crumpling. The people around them seemed oblivious, but for Rob and Haley, the air between them was thick with the weight of all they'd been through. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze with red-rimmed eyes. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, even if you can't forgive me. I needed you to know that. Rob studied her, feeling the remnants of his anger begin to fade, replaced by a strange, hollow acceptance. I hear you, Haley, and maybe one day I'll find it in myself to forgive you. But right now, I can't. And I won't give you the relief you're looking for just because you finally feel regret. He stood up, placing a few bills on the table for their coffee. She didn't move, simply staring down at her hands, the reality settling in that this was the end. Goodbye, Haley, he said softly, turning to leave. Goodbye, Rob, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she walked out of the cafe. Rob felt lighter. There was no satisfaction in seeing her so broken, but there was a sense of closure. He had faced the pain, the anger, and the hurt, and now he could walk away, free of the past. Later that night, he joined his hiking group at a trailhead where Lucia was waiting with her usual warm smile. She noticed something different in him as he approached, a calmness she hadn't seen before. How did it go? She asked gently. He shrugged, giving a small smile. It went exactly how it was supposed to. I think I finally closed that door. Lucia nodded, understanding. Sometimes that's the best we can do, move forward and leave the rest behind. As they began their hike, Rob felt a sense of peace settle over him. His past was just that, the past. With Lucia by his side, he realized that he didn't need anything else, and certainly not Haley's forgiveness, to find happiness again. His life was his own, and he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Rob took a deep breath, standing at the edge of a lake. This place had once been a haven for him and Haley, filled with memories of weekend getaways and anniversary picnics. Now it was a blank canvas, a place he could return to with a new sense of peace, free of the past. The evening sun glistened on the water, casting a warm, quiet glow, and for the first time, he felt a true sense of closure. Just then, Lucia arrived, carrying a small bag with a picnic blanket and thermos. She gave him a warm smile as she walked up, her presence grounding and steady. They had started as friends in a hiking club, but over the past months, something deeper had blossomed between them, a feeling Rob hadn't expected to experience again. "Thought you'd be here," she said, laying the blanket on the grass. "Hope you don't mind. I brought a little something to celebrate." Rob chuckled. "I don't know if today is really a day for celebrating." Lucia sat down, patting the spot beside her. "It's an end, Rob, and sometimes that's worth celebrating." He sat down, feeling the weight of his past slowly lift with her words. "It feels strange, like there's finally room in my life, or for something else. I didn't think I'd ever get to this place." Lucia poured coffee into 2 cups, handing him one. "It's hard to let go of something that defined so much of your life, but you've been brave, Rob, facing it moving forward. That takes strength." The coffee, the warmth spreading through him. "I used to think strength meant holding on, sticking it out no matter what, but now I realize it can mean letting go too." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower over the water. Rob felt a calmness he hadn't known for years. It wasn't just the end of his marriage with Haley, it was the beginning of something new, a life he could shape on his own terms. "I don't want to bring up too much of the past, but Haley called me again this morning," he admitted, shaking his head. I didn't answer. Lucia raised an eyebrow. "And how did that feel?" she asked. "Good," he said, surprising himself. "I felt no need to go back to give her any more of my time. It's like whatever power she had over me is gone." She smiled, resting her hand on his arm. "That's because you took it back. She doesn't control your life anymore." As they watched the sky change from amber to deep blue, Rob looked over at Lucia. She had been his confidant, his friend, and now possibly more. In her presence, he felt none of the hidden anxieties or doubts that had plagued his past. It was as if he could finally be himself, free from judgment or expectation. "Lucia, I don't know what comes next, but I know that I'm ready for it," he said quietly. "You've been with me through all this, thank you." She leaned closer, her hand finding his. "We'll figure it out together. Whatever you're ready for, Rob. I'm here." Rob held her hand, feeling a warmth and comfort he hadn't felt in years. This was different. It wasn't a grand romance born from passion or excitement. It was quiet, steady, the kind of companionship he realized he'd always wanted. Over the following months, Rob and Lucia's relationship blossomed naturally, built on mutual respect and understanding. They spent their weekends hiking new trails, photographing landscapes, and sharing simple dinners. Rob found himself laughing more, his outlook on life lighter. He even reconnected with old friends, people he'd lost touch with over the years, who welcomed him back without judgment or questions. One evening, Rob invited Lucia over for a quiet dinner. As they finished their meal, he looked at her across the table, feeling a sense of gratitude. "It's strange," he said, breaking the silence. "I thought love was supposed to be overwhelming, all-consuming, but with you it's peaceful. I've never known anything like it." Lucia smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Maybe love isn't supposed to feel like losing yourself," she said. "Maybe it's about finding yourself with someone who makes you feel whole." He nodded, feeling her words resonate deeply. "Haley never made me feel this way. I spent years thinking that was just how relationships were, but now I realize I don't have to settle." "You deserve this," Rob, Lucia said softly. "After everything, you deserve to be happy." As they finished their coffee, he knew he wanted to keep her in his life. For the first time, he felt ready for a new chapter, one that was free from the shadows of the past. One afternoon, Rob received a final letter from Haley. He sat by the window, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Her words were remorseful, filled with apologies and reflections. She admitted that her life with Gary had crumbled quickly, leaving her alone and burdened by guilt. She wrote of her regret, of her realization of all she'd lost. But this time, Rob didn't feel the familiar pain of anger or hurt. Instead, he felt nothing. He set the letter aside, understanding that he no longer needed her apologies. The forgiveness she sought was something she'd have to find within herself. That weekend, Rob and Lucia went hiking on a new trail he had discovered. As they reached the summit, the view stretched for miles, the landscape vast and open. They stood there side by side, breathing in the fresh mountain air. "This view is incredible," Lucia said, smiling as she looked out over the valley below. Rob nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. "I don't think I could have done this a year ago. I wouldn't have even thought about coming here." She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "And now," she said, taking his hand. "Now, I feel like there's so much ahead, more than I ever thought possible." They stood together, taking in the silence and beauty around them. Rob felt a sense of peace, of freedom he hadn't felt before. He knew there would still be challenges, moments of doubt, but with Lucia by his side, he felt ready to face them all. As they began their descent, Rob felt a new sense of purpose. Life had given him a second chance, and this time, he was determined to make the most of it.